Hello, everyone, and welcome to our final event of the day, how the U.S. delivers on ambitious methane mitigation at home and abroad. And now, let's welcome to the podium Rick Duke, Deputy Special Presidential Envoy for Climate.
Hello, welcome to the U.S. Center. Really pleased to be here today. I'm Rick Duke, the Deputy to John Kerry, our Special Presidential Envoy for Climate. It's been a big few days here at COP for methane. Just yesterday, the U.S. and China with UAE co-hosted a summit on methane and non-CO2 where over $1 billion in new grant funding was announced and a set of key actions by governments and new members in the fight to cut methane pollution were joining with us, including Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, the 4th and 12th largest emitters of oil and gas methane, respectively. Today, right now, for this panel, we're focused on how the United States is delivering on methane action at the national level, at the state level, and internationally. But before we turn to the panel to cover those topics, I'm honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Michael Regan. And he's going to talk about some compelling new actions just announced on the oil and gas sector in the United States. Without further ado.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. It's a great day to be here in Dubai for COP28. On day one of this administration, President Biden launched the most progressive climate agenda in our nation's history. The president vowed to restore America's role as the global leader in the fight against climate change, while prioritizing the health and safety of our nation's most vulnerable communities. And EPA is proudly at the center of that. Global action to reduce methane emissions, a potent greenhouse gas, is critical to realizing the Paris Agreement target of keeping additional warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. The United States, well, we're doing our part. Just yesterday, EPA announced rigorous final technology standards for methane emissions from the oil and gas sector. This historic action will reduce the equivalence of 1.5 billion metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions. This rule would not be as strong or would not be possible without industry, states, and organizations that were willing to come to the table and were working to help us tackle this urgent climate challenge. The result is a historic action that adopts stronger technology standards and adapts as industry develops the latest and greatest methane technology, bolstering innovation. This action is crucial as we discuss efforts abroad to reduce methane emissions. We're excited by the potential significant commitments and actions of over 150 nations as they have made to advance the global methane pledge launched 2 years ago by President Biden and other world leaders. This ambitious initiative aims to spur global action to reduce emissions of methane by 30% below 30% from 2020 levels by 2030. I'm proud of the sweeping actions of the United States and that we're taking to reduce methane across all of our federal agencies to implement the 2021 U.S. Methane Emissions Reduction Action Plan in support of the global methane pledge. We all know that oil and gas is the largest source of methane emissions in the United States. And EPA has been committed to taking bold action to address these emissions. Just last year, Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides EPA with new authorities to reduce methane emissions from the oil and gas sector through the Methane Emissions Reduction Program. Through this program, EPA is advancing efforts to improve the efficiency of U.S. oil and gas operations, create new, good-paying jobs in energy communities, and realize near-term emission reductions, all of which directly contribute to the Biden-Harris administration's ambitious climate and air quality goals. The program incentivizes early implementation of innovative technologies and best practices to allow the United States to quickly reduce greenhouse gas emissions that threaten public health and provide American energy savings. EPA and the Department of Energy announced earlier this year that 14 states will receive $350 million in funding to help measure and reduce methane emissions. This is the first in a series of funding opportunities targeting monitoring and reduction of methane emissions from this sector. EPA also recently proposed changes to our greenhouse gas reporting program regulations for oil and gas facilities and looks forward to reviewing the public comments that we'll receive. Congress also directed EPA to implement a waste emissions charge for applicable oil and gas facilities that exceed certain waste emissions thresholds, and we're currently developing this proposed rule and looking forward to sharing more on that soon as well. All of these actions are designed to work in harmony with one of the most significant actions to date, the final technology standards we announced yesterday to sharply reduce methane pollution and other harmful air pollution from the oil and gas industry will serve as examples of when President Biden declared that America was back in the driving seat on the international stage. Methane and other pollutants like smog forming organic compounds are harmful to the health and vitality of communities nationwide, including low-income and minority communities, which are oftentimes disproportionately located near oil and gas facilities. Folks, I've been on the ground in these communities. I've met face-to-face with generations of family members who have been overburdened by this pollution for far too long. The impact of this historic rule cannot be overstated. These standards will prevent an estimated 58 million tons of methane emissions by 2038, equivalent to 1.5 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide. That's nearly as much carbon dioxide as emitted by the entire power sector in the year 2021. To put it another way, the rule will achieve a nearly 80% reduction in methane emissions compared to reductions that would occur without this rule. Not to mention preventing 16 million tons of smog-forming volatile organic compounds and just under 600,000 tons of toxic air pollutants by 2028. That means 95,000 fewer cases of asthma symptoms and 35,000 fewer lost days of school for our children. For perspective, the rule will deliver a net climate and ozone health benefit of around $98 billion by 2038 and save enough gas to heat 7.8 million homes just this winter. This is historic news for our climate, for our future, and for our children. And if that wasn't enough, yesterday I was also pleased to announce our draft national strategy for reducing food loss and waste and recycling organics. This draft strategy, a partnership with the United States Department of Agriculture and the Food and Drug Administration, lays out concrete actions all three agencies will take to prevent food loss and waste, increase recycling of organic materials, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and save thousands of households and businesses money while building cleaner communities. We're taking action to ensure that strong implementation of ongoing regulations in the landfill sector, improving our understanding of emission sources, and voluntary programs will complement all of our regulatory efforts. Important to this work are the efforts to reduce food waste. When food ends up in a landfill, all of the resources that went into producing, distributing, preparing, and disposing of the food are wasted, and decomposing food and organics emit methane from our landfills. Those methane emissions from landfills are the third largest source of human-related methane in the United States. Each year, U.S. food loss and waste contributes to the greenhouse gas emissions equivalent to that of 60 coal-fired power plants and requires enough water and energy to supply more than 50 million homes per year. In fact, EPA's recent research shows that food waste is responsible for 58% of methane emissions released from landfills in the United States. We must do more. We have to do more to reduce this important driver of pollution that harms our communities. Our research also demonstrates that an effective way to reduce these methane emissions is to keep food out of landfills in the first place. Our U.S. Methane Emissions Reduction Action Plan identifies food waste prevention and organic waste diversion as the top two methane emission reduction strategies for municipal solid waste. It's not just our new national strategy that will tackle this challenge. This year, we also announced nearly $200 million in the bipartisan infrastructure law funding, the largest federal investment in recycling in 30 years. Of that $198 million, over $83 million in funding will support projects that include activities related to organics recycling, composting, and anaerobic digestion. The activities outlined in these projects are critical in addressing the effects of climate change, as organic materials sent to landfills release large amounts of methane. Bold efforts like this to reduce global methane pollution can make significant progress in mitigating near-term climate change while securing multiple health and economic benefits. The United States continues to support collaborative international methane mitigation efforts, especially through the leadership of the Global Methane Initiative and the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. Under President Biden's leadership, the United States continues to advance ambitious goals to achieve significant emission reductions at home, as well as collaborations with our international partners. Folks, together, we can achieve global methane reductions that will help meet our climate goals and protect people and the planet and our communities. So thank you all for your partnership, and thank you all for being here.
Now I'd like to welcome all the panelists to the stage for a quick photo. Let's give them a round of applause again.
Thank you, Administrator Regan. Thank you for your leadership. Okay, let's all get started with the panel. Let me begin by a quick set of introductions. We've got a really fantastic lineup here covering all the angles on methane mitigation. First, to my left, Assistant Secretary Crabtree of the U.S. Department of Energy is going to speak to the R&D aspect, especially as it relates to the oil and gas sector and the broader work of the Department of Energy on methane. Gillian Caldwell, Chief Climate Officer for the U.S. Agency for International Development, will speak to methane abatement as a co-benefit of international development programming and what we sometimes call methanizing development operations at the Agency for International Development, if you will. Leanne Randolph, Chair of the California Air Resources Board, which is always at the forefront of action to address the nexus of air pollution and climate. Fred Krupp, who runs the Environmental Defense Fund. So my first question to the panelists is proof that this is not hardball. I want to get a sense quickly from each of you as to what you are most proud of on methane action in your respective domains over recent months, or over the last year, let's say. Let's start with you, Brad.
Great. Thank you, Rick. I'll take an example that is maybe not the most high-profile thing, but is a real example of leadership, I think, on the part of the United States to advance methane mitigation. There's been, for a number of years, a real effort in the United States around the world to better measure and account for methane emissions in natural gas, both natural gas from a production standpoint, but also transport and end uses. And those methodologies and certification programs and other things that have been developed, it's a really positive thing. There's a lot of innovation in the marketplace, but it's also creating a lot of confusion. And there are different approaches yield different results. And so if we're going to have credibility in the marketplace and bring the methane and CO2 intensity of our natural gas down over time, we have to get an agreed form of measurement. You can't solve a problem that you can't agree on how to measure. And so what we did after consulting a lot of stakeholders here in the United States and organizing some public events to get input, we worked with the European Commission and we convened 17 countries from around the world. And it's a real diversity of countries. Some of the largest oil and gas exporters in the world, as well as some of the largest natural gas importers, and also a number of developing countries from the global south. And by May, we stood up this work group, It's been meeting. We're getting some input from stakeholders in the United States and around the world, and we just released a joint announcement across 17 countries globally about our commitment to continue this work and to complete the development of a framework, a globally agreed to framework for measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification of greenhouse gases. So at the end of the day, if you're in Europe or Korea and you're purchasing gas, you can distinguish between the greenhouse gas intensity of an LNG cargo coming from the Gulf Coast or Qatar, or you can distinguish between the emissions intensity of gas coming from the Marcellus Shale Basin or the Permian. And what that will do is it will create real pressure on companies to improve their performance, and those companies that are investing in solutions will see benefits in the marketplace.
Thank you, Brad. And it's really fantastic to see, on top of all this national standard setting and action, real international consideration of even traded fossil fuels and making sure that we're measuring with confidence the emissions profile of those traded fossil fuels and addressing those emissions over time. Gillian.
Okay, so I was proud to begin with, but I was even prouder after I heard what Administrator Regan had to say, not only because the new methane rules are amazing, but also because our actions in just the last year through the Agency for International Development are going to reduce methane significantly more than even those impressive rules. So you referred to the methanization of our programming. I think it's the demethanization of our programming. In Kenya, just by way of example, through feed changes with livestock, which of course is a primary source of emissions, we were able to reduce emissions by 28% while increasing productivity by 43%. And incidentally, as you may be aware, crops suffer when they are surrounded with methane emissions. So I'm talking about livestock productivity. That's not to mention the benefits for the crops. In sanitation, we did a number of things also in Kenya. One is turning fecal waste, and this is a trick. I'm not sure how this works exactly. Turning fecal waste into insect-based protein for animal feed. Maybe someone else can explain how that works. Reducing methane or carbon dioxide equivalent by 19,000 tons. In Asia and Latin America, doing work with respect to solid waste management, and this is where we've really seen the bang for our buck. We've been supporting municipalities to manage solid waste more appropriately, and the reductions we're seeing from that work is 98,000 metric tons. And then in Nigeria, of course, a lot of talk about oil and gas, venting and flaring. We are basically supporting the government to provide commercialization licenses to 42 firms that are expected to support the reduction of 6 to 7 million tons of methane reduction, generate $1 billion in revenue, and of course lots of green jobs. So all of this is through looking for opportunities for co-benefits across our portfolio, waste management, agriculture, and oil and gas, because we don't have methane-specific funding. We have marginal amount, which we so appreciate from SPEC, which I'll talk to you about later. But what we're trying to do is to see how we can do more with other flavors of funding in the absence of that particular flavor. And I think we're doing a great job, so I'm proud of the team.
Yeah, thank you. And just to underscore, for those who don't track this as closely as all of our panelists do, when you cut methane, you also cut ground-level ozone. And when you reduce ground-level ozone, you radically address public health benefits and also address crop loss. 6% of global crop loss is caused by ground-level ozone. So many co-benefits here. Leanne.
So in California, we're very proud of the fact that we are one of the few jurisdictions that has a statutory methane reduction target, 40% below 2013 levels by 2030. And when the legislature adopted that target, that catalyzed a lot of activity. My agency, the California Air Resources Board, adopted a short-lived climate pollutant strategy that identified specific actions to reduce methane and other short-lived climate pollutants. And so that resulted subsequently in a 2017 regulation to regulate oil and gas facilities and put additional methane requirements on those facilities. And in fact, just earlier this year, we updated that regulation to be consistent with US EPA's oil and gas methane regulations. We also have a strategy around the agricultural sector. We have devoted significant resources to deploying digesters to capture methane. We have also funded research at UC Davis and elsewhere to tackle enteric methane emissions from livestock. We have alternative manure management programs that we are funding to result in methane reductions in the livestock sector. And then, as Administrator Regan mentioned, one of the key methane reduction strategies is diverting food waste from landfills. So we have our sister agency, Cal Recycle, has adopted specific regulations around requiring composting of food waste in jurisdictions throughout the state. And in addition, we have adopted rules requiring landfills to capture their methane and reduce their emissions as well through measures in addition to just diversion. So all of these strategies are really it's getting us towards our goal. We still have a ways to go, but we are trying to deploy as many strategies as possible to be as effective as possible in getting to that 2030 target in California.
Yeah, thank you. And since there's been quite a bit of reference to waste sector methane, I'll just note that part of yesterday's many announcements was the Lowering Organic Waste Methane or Low Methane Initiative, which is specifically about engaging especially subnational governments globally on waste sector methane. So I hope that California will, as it always does, engage globally to share all the leadership that you have in the state of California. Fred.
Well, thanks, Rick. I guess you asked what I'm most proud about vis-a-vis methane, and without a doubt, I'm most proud about the incredible team that we have at EDF that has been on this journey for over 10 years now. What they've done is amazing, and it's been a privilege to get a chance to learn from them and work with them. It started back in a dozen years ago when we figured out that methane was such a powerful greenhouse gas and something we actually could do something about. Then, in the Obama administration, Secretary Chu invited me to be on a panel to how to develop America's shale resource. And there were 7 of us on this panel. By the way, if you're on a panel of only 7, you really have to work. It's not just an honorific thing. So the way I worked, the way EDF worked, was to bring the message that if America is going to continue to drill or expand for drilling for natural gas, it's got to clean up its methane problem. That report, when it was issued, was the first time that methane broke into the news, and many people felt it quite surprising that the U.S. government was saying that, or an advisory panel was saying that. Then we needed to find some state that would actually be willing to regulate it. So as our team did what ended up being over $20 million of testing, because no one knew how much methane was coming from the oil and gas industry, John Hickenlooper, then governor of Colorado, would tell you that I badgered him until he agreed to have methane regulations, but he didn't ask EDF to write them. He was smarter than that. He asked EDF to get together with a bunch of oil and gas companies and figure out a way that would meet our ambitious goals, but that they could live with. And they adopted the first ever methane rules on the planet in 2013. From there, we went to other states, but the ultimate goal was to get EPA to regulate. In 2016, in the last year of the Obama administration, rules were passed on new sources of oil and gas and what methane could come out of them. But it turns out existing sources would be 90% of the problem going forward. And until yesterday, there were no regulations of existing sources. But in 2017, after administrations changed, the Senate took a run at repealing the Obama administration rules, and I'm very proud that the first time President Trump was defeated in the United States Senate was when a Congressional Review Act resolution failed because one senator, do you remember which one, went like this? The late John McCain voted no, and we prevailed by one vote and protected the methane rules on new sources. But I'm so excited that yesterday Administrator Regan announced the strongest rules on the planet for methane that he just referred to here again. These rules are not only important for the United States, which produces about 14% of the oil and gas in the world, but they project to the rest of the world because oil and gas companies are really interested. The U.S. sets the standard for everyone won't necessarily follow, but they are the bar. And then we get to yesterday, where in addition to those rules being set, I'm proud that EDF's team was able to work with Dr. Sultan and the COP presidency, first suggesting what would be the actionable part of the oil and gas decarbonization agenda. 3 things. 1, there needed to be an 80 to 90% reduction from any company participating, and that will be the average reduction of the 50 oil and gas companies that are participating, including the largest oil and gas company in the world by far, Saudi Aramco, which signed up yesterday, Exxon, the second largest oil and gas company in the world. Second, they had to achieve these reductions not by some faraway year like 2050, but by 2030. And third, they would have to do it with independent third party actually monitoring. One thing we've learned is when people estimate emissions, it's a bunch of bull. When we measured, we found out the numbers that were being reported to EPA under EPA's protocols were underestimates by 60%. And so it's so important whenever we're putting together databases, we use empirical measurements, not phony estimates. And so I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Fred, and thanks to all the panelists for those answers. Let me now turn back to you again, Brad, and ask you to say a little bit more about how methane fits in with the overall mission of Department of Energy, and specifically maybe comment a bit on how this monitoring, reporting, and verification work that you're driving relates to what's happening in the European Union with their efforts around imported fossil fuels, or the global conversation really about traded fossil fuels and methane related to same.
Great. Well, I think most of the folks in the audience know this. The Department of Energy is a mission-driven department focused on research development, and thanks to the Infrastructure Bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, increasingly commercial demonstration and deployment of energy and climate solutions. In the Biden administration, we've been reorienting that basic research development and demonstration work to meet the President's climate goals, and I think many of you know them. 50 to 52% reductions by 2030, zero emissions in the power sector by 2035, and net zero emissions economy-wide by 2050. But there's another goal that doesn't necessarily get elevated among those 3 as often, and that's to get to practically zero emissions in the oil and gas sector for methane. And you can obviously never eliminate all emissions, but zero in any practical sense by 2030 for the oil and gas sector is what we're aiming at. We have a methane mitigation R&D program in our Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. By the standards of these types of things, it's quite large. We spend about $60 million a year just in methane research, RD&D alone. And it runs the gamut from detection to measurement to monitoring and ultimately to direct mitigation technologies. Increasingly, the technologies have been advancing so rapidly. You know, Fred hasn't talked about satellites yet, but he probably will. But as these technologies advance, the integration of these technologies and practices becomes increasingly important as well. So we're funding R&D that helps companies and institutions bring together all the tools in an integrated way to provide more accurate measurements and reconciling, for example, the differences we get from satellite, from aerial, and from continuous measurement on the ground. And again, where this comes back to measurement, reporting, and verification is that we need a methodology for measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification where you can have different approaches, different methodologies, but they all need to meet a minimum set of performance criteria. They need to have a common independent verification, third-party verification, also a common approach to data transparency, so that if you're a government or a company purchasing gas or a stakeholder who cares about this, you have access to consistent information. And then the final part is that it can't just be industry overseeing industry. You can't have the fox in the hen house type phenomenon. So there needs to be some larger coordination. It can involve industry and non-governmental organizations, and it should, but there has to be government in that role. And to your final question, how does that all relate back to the European Union? You know, they issued their rulemaking. They are looking to OGMP, the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, for companies to report their emissions, but we have a dialogue about with the European Union. The fact is OGMP itself has gaps, and so the goal of this effort is to develop a framework that raises the bar collectively so we can really have confidence in the numbers and how we measure them. And for the European Union, it's the largest market in terms of natural gas imports in the world. So they're going to drive a lot of improvements in the natural gas supply chain. We've been telling the European Union for a long time, we want them to have strong regulation. We want them to demand continuously lower methane and CO2 emissions in the natural gas supply chain. That helps us meet our climate goals.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. And I'll just note, because it can be a source of confusion, IEA has been very clear that even the International Energy Agency, that even on the most ambitious 1.5 aligned trajectory globally, we can't simply wait for the energy transition to address oil and gas methane. We have to strive for the fastest possible energy transition, consistent with that 1.5C objective, and at the same time, right now, cut methane, because it alone, oil and gas methane elimination alone, can cut 0.1C of today's climate change and really help us with kind of our near-term costs and risks of climate change accordingly. Gillian, so you've got a broad agenda at AID, a lot at stake in terms of overall development objectives. Why is methane a priority for AID?
Well, for all the reasons you just stated, to be sure. It's 83 times more potent than carbon dioxide for the first 20 years, which underscores its role as a highly toxic, short-lived climate pollutant. So here we are with an F on the global stock take. I don't know what grade you would give us, but we're nowhere near where we need to be. Lots of good promises on paper, but just not ratcheting it back soon enough. So our best near-term opportunity to address global warming is through methane reductions, given its nature as a short-lived climate pollutant. So we're passionate about it for just that reason.
Thanks, Gillian. And Leanne, can you say more about the role of California and of states in addressing methane across agriculture waste and fossil sources?
Yeah, absolutely. California's role as a subnational is really to bring as many other jurisdictions with us as we can to take action. So building on the incredible success of the Global Methane Pledge from COP26, California has spearheaded the Subnational Methane Action Coalition, which we sort of previewed at Climate Week and then formally announced and signed today. We started gathering some subnationals together to work on this. We now have 14 different jurisdictions, and we're eagerly signing up more. And it's really about sharing information, working together, creating that collaborative energy, to tackle methane emissions in all of the different sectors. It's, different economies have different major sources, right? Some are more focused on ag, some are more focused on oil and gas, some are more focused on the waste sector. Some of us are trying to do it all. And working together to identify those solutions, to share information, to share data. And I'm sure we'll talk some more about data going forward, but I think it's really important to highlight the opportunities to share that data. The California legislature has set aside $100 million to help build a data platform from satellite data to get that information out there, have it be accessible to organizations and communities. And that community-based interaction is so important. One of the initiatives we have in California is our methane enforcement task force, where we are working with local air districts and with other agencies to identify leaks, plug them, and disclose them to the public so the public knows what's happening out there in the field. We have a lot of abandoned and orphan wells in California, and when we identify leaks, we want to make sure we're taking action very quickly and that we're disclosing that information to folks so they understand what's happening on the ground. So all of that work we can share with other jurisdictions and try to replicate that work and really achieve reductions on an international level.
Thank you. And Fred, you've been working in the U.S. context and internationally for a long time on the question of standard setting for, in particular, fossil methane. When it comes to really getting that job done, it is true that regulators face significant challenges, measurement, politics, sometimes economics. Can you speak a little bit to the challenges and any thoughts you have about the way forward to pick up the pace on getting the standards in place that we need globally? Fantastic to see Administrator Regan's announcement on the U.S. Standards in the fossil sector, but of course this is a global challenge. Fantastic also to see 2 of the top 20 oil and gas methane emitters joining the effort yesterday at the summit, Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. But say a little bit more about what it takes to actually move from intention to standard setting.
Well, what it takes, Rick, is data. And as Brad said, the good news is it's becoming much cheaper and easier to get a lot more data, good data. And so, when I left you with the impression that up until recently, EPA's procedures allowed companies to do what was easy and convenient for them, to just report estimates, we learned that the estimates were dramatically underreporting. But yesterday that was corrected. Michael Regan finalized an EPA rule requiring the companies to use data, and that is so great. But you're right, Rick, it's only 14% of the oil and gas business around that is in the United States. So what will get the rest of the world to use good data? One of the things is the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter, which not only says you need an 80% reduction, or 80 to 90%, get down to 0.2 when we know the companies are now up at 2% of the methane they take out of the ground is just going into the air. But in addition to that, there is this requirement, as I said earlier, for the companies to submit to independent international standards, be transparent about it. And that transparency is going to also be helped by the fact that the European Union has adopted this methane standard and explicitly anticipates, as the biggest importer in the world, requiring exporters. And Japan is moving in a similar direction. Japan is now partnering with Malaysia and others of their suppliers to get them to clean up, because as a consumer of gas, they understand part of their footprint is how that gas is produced, and they're beginning to take responsibility for helping. So I think the world is moving in the right direction. As Brad mentioned, there is also Methane Sat, a satellite that is now built thanks to philanthropic contributions from the Bezos Earth Fund and Warren John Arnold and many others, and it is now going to launch next year. And we also announced yesterday, or I should say the Bloomberg Philanthropies announced that they're going to give $40 million to make sure there's accountability. $25 million will come to a partnership of EDF and also the International Energy Agency and IMEO to make sure there's accountability. The IMEO, if those of you don't know, is a very important, it's the International Methane Emissions Observatory. It is the worldwide platform of data for all sources of methane, and it will take any credible data, whether it's from satellites or ground measurements. And so having that now as part of the United Nations Environmental Program is a godsend to this issue.
Thanks, Fred. And I'll just note that part of what IMEO is doing is the Methane Alert and Response System, which is a real-time system that's up and operational, fully operational as of yesterday, which is using satellite measurements to detect super emitter events as they happen and to work with governments and national oil companies to make sure that they can respond in real time and really plug those leaks and recover that otherwise wasted product. Brad, I'm going to just turn back to you and ask if I could give you the floor to talk a little bit about the $250 million that was put together yesterday, actually $255 million that was put together as part of the $1 billion in new grant funding. Came from UAE and a set of companies that's going to the World Bank to a new trust fund, the Global Gas Flaring and Methane Reduction Partnership. And the purpose of this trust fund is to help national oil companies in low-income countries, places like Turkmenistan or Kazakhstan or others that you might list and that you work with, to help them to do the front-end work required to actually tackle flaring, venting, and leakage reduction in the sector. So just going to invite you to speak a little bit about what that kind of support can achieve and why it's even necessary.
Well, so there's a big distinction between the global oil majors and some of the, like you think an Exxon or a Chevron or a Total. They're integrated from production all the way down to retail. They're global. They have enormous capacity to do projects. They're some of the most capable and powerful institutions on the planet. There are many national oil companies. They may be quite large, but they don't have the same level of technical capacity. They aren't necessarily subject to the same regulatory requirements. And then in some cases, some of these national oil and gas industries are smaller and undercapitalized as well. And there are exceptions, of course. There's Saudi Aramco, there's ADNOC here in this country, which is comparable to the majors. But there's a big gap in the world, and there needs to be a real effort to bring those national oil companies along because they represent a very large part of oil and gas production globally and a very large portion of methane emissions, and even more so as the oil majors ratchet down their emissions, this disparity will become even greater. I'm actually not, to be totally candid, an expert on when you get to how you actually do the methane mitigation at an oil well site or along pipelines. There's obviously, we're working at an R&D level with the various technologies and practices to literally plug those leaks, and then how you do it as part of a larger integrated system. But one of the things that I have consistently heard from oil companies that have been working with some of the national oil companies, I'm talking now the majors, literally as projects to try to improve performance, is that a lot of this really isn't intentional. This is really about know-how, it's about management, it's about habit. Managing methane is an ongoing process. It isn't just you put on one valve and you're done. It's a whole way of approaching the business that is frankly inculcated in a lot of the larger oil companies, but not necessarily in these national oil companies. And so in some of these projects, and governments have done this as well, what you find is when the satellites detect the super emitters, these are these really large volume methane leaks, vast methane leaks, might be at a gas processing plant or at an oil site or some other type of infrastructure. The companies responsible for that asset often don't even know about it. And when they are respectfully approached by a government or another oil company, what I've heard, and I don't have direct experience of this, is they often appreciate knowing and they appreciate assistance in trying to solve the problem. So sure, there are bad actors, but I think as we ramp up these efforts through the World Bank, we're going to find that especially with methane emissions, a lot of these problems are eminently solvable. You just need goodwill, resources, and a structure to be systematic about it, country by country, basin, oil and gas basin by oil and gas basin, asset by asset, and really evaluate where the emissions are coming from, what are the, locationally, what are the sources at those sites, and then what are the strategies, not only for stopping those leaks, but then the management practices that monitor and prevent them in the future. And, obviously when you think about it globally, it's a large resource, but for the benefit, as you were pointing out earlier, the benefit we get in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reductions and impact, it's actually a very small investment with a huge return.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. And Gillian, AID is really at the forefront of putting methane into what you're doing on agricultural productivity or waste management or broader development. Can you say a little bit about how it's going with sister agencies, other aid agencies or multilateral development banks, just a bit about the status of the conversation globally on development and methane in development?
Well, sadly, methane abatement funding constitutes 2% of the global climate funding, which is why the work that you all did to establish that new fund at the World Bank is so critically important and still a drop in the bucket in the scheme of things. So Administrator Power, who is the head of the agency I work at, the Agency for International Development, and Special Envoy Kerry signed a joint letter to a range of governments around the world recently to really encourage them to prioritize methane abatement and programming. And I think it's just an enormous missed opportunity at this stage. We're not seeing anything like the scope and scale of action we'd want to see. And, to your earlier question, why are we doing the work? I emphasized the benefits in terms of reducing global warming and temperatures in the near term. There's just so many other co-benefits, as you've alluded to, and as I mentioned, when it comes to crop failure, when it comes to human health, which is the case across the board where you look at interventions to tackle the climate crisis. So I think it's a question of really sort of turbocharging the education, the awareness, and the opportunity. As was just noted, it's eminently doable. I mean, it's not difficult to do this. It's actually a lower hanging fruit than a lot of other interventions that we're trying to leverage. So we just need to see so much more. And I think we are starting to pick up the pace. And really gratitude to you and Spec Carey for your leadership in this area.
Thank you. And Leanne, if I could ask, California is, as I mentioned before, really legendary in this space of climate and clean air nexus, and methane's right there at the heart of it. Can you comment a bit with your wisdom on all that as to what elements of your toolkit are most effective for tackling methane? You've got the cap and trade program, you've got funding from that, you've got standard setting, a whole range of things. Can you comment a bit on what really works from your experience?
Well, first of all, that 2% figure is kind of shocking. So kind of reflecting on California's experience, I mean, to your point, we have invested a lot of our greenhouse gas reduction funds towards methane reduction in the agricultural sector. It's sort of, I guess to me, the methane question is emblematic of our approach to climate strategy, right? Part of it is incentives. Part of it is taking our greenhouse gas reduction fund and investing it in effective strategies. Part of it is regulatory. Establishing clear rules for the oil and gas sector, implementing those rules, working with local governments to do the monitoring and the verification and enforcement of those rules. And it's about partnerships, like working on the Subnational Methane Action Coalition. So it's the same strategies we're using in a lot of our other climate work, but it's bringing it to bear to address methane. And as I mentioned, a lot of this is about research. It's about gathering more information. It's about being as effective as possible in deploying that. The work we're doing with our academic partners to identify the sources and identify the correct strategies. So I feel like it's sort of the California model kind of applied to this specific pollutant that we have deployed, from back in the days of the catalytic converter.
Thank you. And Fred, you've invoked measurement first, and you've been at the satellite game for a while. How good are the measurements, and how good will they get?
Great question. So the measurements right now, even from satellites, aren't that good. TROPOMI, which is the European Space Agency methane satellite, can see gigantic leaks, really super events that result from equipment malfunction. GHGSat is a very good instrument. It can pinpoint leaks, local leaks above a certain size. And soon we'll have Carbon Mapper, which will be another, the more satellites, the better. The more information we have, the better. But even all of those satellites don't yet see, TROPOMI looks at the whole globe. GHGSat, Carbon Mapper, and some others are targeted instruments looking at local areas. What we don't have yet is something that will look at a whole wide area, say 100 by 200 kilometers. How important is that? Because intuitively, these super events, these super emitters, sound like they're a big part of the problem. Well, actually, they are a very important part of the problem. It is great we now have an effort from satellites to notify and close them, and I completely agree with you, Brad. Everything I've heard is the same. When operators know they're emitting, they take action. But to try to figure it out, since there wasn't good measurement yet, we put the methane sat, the same equipment we will launch early next year, into space. We put it on an airplane, and we flew it over every oil basin in the United States. And here's what we learned. In Utah, in the Uinta Basin, 88% of the methane leaks are the chronic leaks, the ones that are 24/7 that go on for years. And you think about it, maybe that is intuitive. These small leaks that go on forever that aren't super events, 88% of the total is widespread. Okay, well, the Uinta Basin may be at one end of the spectrum. Every single basin we looked at, and we think the majority of basins, certainly in the United States, we think all the basins in the United States, these chronic leaks are the majority of the problem, in many cases the overwhelming majority. And that's what methane satellite, when it's launched, will be the first instrument that can finally give us a cumulative total of all the leaks, because if you're only getting 12%, these big leaks, well, you're only getting 12% of the total. So I really look forward to methane sat being launched next year and having that data fed. Well, anyone with access to the web will have access to it. It will immediately go to IMEO. It will be usable by companies, by governments, by media reporters, by citizen groups, by localities. And the last thing I would say is that this is such an important issue. I think what, Rick, you were so personally involved in, you were involved in many things yesterday, but the U.S., China, the summit with the UAE, that event Michael Regan's announcement of these new rules and the 50 companies in the oil industry that voluntarily agreed to cut methane emissions with built-in accountability, those three things, combined with the fact that we've now got these satellites in the sky, I really think what was announced at the COP yesterday will have more of a profound, quantifiable effect if all of that's delivered on in the next 10 years in reducing the ferocity of cataclysmic storms and temperatures, because methane is so fast acting, than anything that's been announced at any COP previously. It's not all we have to do. The oil and gas industry continues to fall woefully short. We've got to invest in ramping up clean energy. There's so much more we need to do, but it is a good first step. And in terms of what you and I will see in the next 10 years, it's a very big deal.
So I want to thank the panelists and just briefly reflect on a couple of items. So first, let's just put this in context. So when we think about keeping 1.5 degrees centigrade within reach, there's really three big things on the to-do list globally. The first is, of course, the energy transition itself, which is fundamental. The second is ending deforestation and bolstering land carbon sinks globally. And the third is cutting all non-CO2 greenhouse gases, starting with methane, but not ending there. And I just want to close with one more bright note from really yesterday and coming off of the U.S.-China Sunnyland statement just a few weeks ago, which is that in China, the non-CO2 emissions, mainly methane, but also some others like N2O and ground-level ozone, these are, if they were a country, they would be the third largest emission source in the world. And China, in its 2030 nationally determined contribution for the Paris Agreement, wasn't formally including those non-CO2 greenhouse gases, particularly methane, in its target. As of the Sunnyland statement, the U.S.-China Sunnyland statement, in which this methane summit yesterday was called for, China will be including those non-CO2 greenhouse gases in its next round of targets. And only half of the countries in the world currently include all economy-wide greenhouse gases. But now China and the United States, the world's two largest emitters, are squarely in that camp. And really, we encourage all governments to step up and address methane as part and parcel of the Paris Agreement itself. So I want to thank the panelists again, and it's really been a great discussion. Sorry, Brad has an overtime, yeah.
Important. I've never done this before, but you I think, mentioned this. You, Rick, deserve a lot of recognition, and Secretary Kerry, Claire Wang. I don't know if Claire's here, and the SPEC team. Honestly, folks, from the methane pledge last round to the implementation of the pledge to pushing to get folks to commit to funding for methane mitigation, it's been an extraordinary couple of years of leadership. And so I think for Rick and the SPEC team, a round of applause.
Thank you. I clearly should have entered the panel before letting you speak. All right, thanks all.